Welcome, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Emily Troisi. I work for the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network in the Watershed Research and Training Center, and I'm very excited to be your host for today's webinar on Community Wildfire Protection Plans. Today's webinar is hosted by the Ember Alliance, Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, and the Watershed Research and Training Center, coalitions and collaboratives, and the Hispanic Access Foundation as part of a Community Navigators Program through the US Forest Service. We do have closed captioning available today that you can toggle on by using an icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. We also have English to Spanish translation available with our amazing interpreter, Natalia. If you would like to listen to this webinar in Spanish, you can do so by clicking on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your window to toggle between English and Spanish. I'm not going to be on your screen for very long. I just have a couple Zoom reminders for our webinar today. I'll share a little bit about our Community Navigators program, and then I'll turn it over to Bree and Kenzie, our awesome speakers today, to share about Community Wildfire Protection Plans. We will save a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. All right. For a couple Zoom reminders, chat is disabled for our attendees today to try to keep attention on the presentation. You are able to chat panelists and hosts just in case you have any technical help that you need using Zoom. We are using the Q&A box for question and answer. You can enter those questions into that Q&A box at any time. Staff will be monitoring that. I am joined by Jen Gustafson from Coalitions and Collaboratives, and the two of us will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the presentation, as well as Bree and Kenzie. Again, we will save some time at the end to answer some of those questions that are a little bit more in depth live at the end. As I covered at the beginning, closed caption is available and English to Spanish translation is also available. This webinar is also being recorded both in English and in Spanish for use by attendees who could not join us today in person. And we will share out resources and a copy of the slides after the webinar concludes. Really quickly, this webinar is being supported by the Community Navigators Program. The USDA Forest Service launched the Community Navigators Program to support leaders in historically underserved communities find and access funding and partnership support through the US Forest Service. The Community Navigators Program currently consists of 3 implementation partners, which is the Watershed Research and Training Center, Hispanic Access Foundation, and coalitions and collaboratives. And we connect communities to the appropriate resources for building climate resilience through bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act funding. This CWPP series is made possible by the USDA Forest Service Community Navigators Program through a subaward to the Watershed Research and Training Center. This institution is an equal opportunity provider. All right, on that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and welcome Bree and Kenzie up to introduce themselves and kick off our main presentation today. Thanks for joining us, Bree and Kenzie. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Emily. Hi, my name is Kenzie Hart. I'm a wildfire analyst at the Ember Alliance.
And I'm Bree Baker. I'm the Assistant Director of the Resilient Communities and Ecosystems Program with the Ember Alliance.
Wonderful. Give me just a sec. Let me share my screen here. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to chat here about Community Wildfire Protection Plans, as Emily said. We are the Ember Alliance. So the Ember Alliance, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we kind of have three areas of work that we like to work in. One of them is community wildfire planning. So of course, CWPPs and other wildfire risk assessments. We also do wildfire workforce development. So we train firefighters and do some advanced prescribed fire training. And we also have a couple fuels crews, one in North Carolina and one in Northern Colorado right now. So I'll get into what a CWPP is and isn't. About 20 years ago, slightly over at this point, Congress passed what's called the Healthy Forests Restoration Act of 2003. This is after a series of major wildfires in the West with the intent of protecting some of our nation's forests and better preparing our communities for wildfire. The HFRA, the Healthy Forests Restoration Act, had three different components for CWPPs. One of them was collaboration. So we must include a certain number of people or certain groups of people. So someone from a local government, whether that's a county or a city or a town, someone from a local fire department or fire protection district, and the local state forest service or state forester from a Department of Natural Resources. Community input and cross-boundary collaboration is very important to these plans. The second thing is prioritized fuel reduction. So we have to identify locations on the landscape where we're going to be treating for fuels reduction and wildfire risk mitigation. And third is structural ignitability. We have to address that structures need to take action to reduce their chance of igniting, and we need to emphasize that for individual homeowners, it is their responsibility to make sure their homes are hardened to wildfire. These are fairly minimal requirements. It's pretty vague, and that was intentional. It allows for a lot of flexibility across the nation. So a lot of different states have their own additional CWPP guidelines in addition to these ones that are at the national level. And if you want to know if your state has those, go ahead and reach out to either your state forest service or your Department of Natural Resources for them. Most of them have them posted online. While these are fairly vague, there was a process that kind of has been developed over the last 20 years that most CWPPs tend to follow. And that process looks like this. We start out by identifying what our goals are and who's working on the project. We have to gather local knowledge, what the community values, what's already been done. We're going to assess our wildfire risk. So what is our anticipated fire behavior and what types of things are at risk from that wildfire. We're going to prioritize what projects we can do, because we can't treat everything. So we have to figure out what ones are the most important for us to treat first. And then we develop that action plan. They can be a little different. There's so many different ways to do CWPPs, but this is the process that most folks have tended to follow. So what is a CWPP, a Community Wildfire Protection Plan? First and foremost, it is a process. It's a facilitated process so a community and leaders within that community can understand what their wildfire risk is and find out what steps they can take and need to take to reduce that risk. The repeated connections through this process, through the time that it takes to go through all these steps, builds relationship and trust, and that is the basis for the collaboration that these cross-boundary treatments need to have these projects actually actionable in the future. And second, as the name implies, the CWPP is a plan. You have to have planned action items, and for that plan to be implementable, we want those to be what's known as SMART goals, so specific, measurable, achievable, relevant to this, and time-bound. A CWPP itself is not a legally binding document. It does not require anyone to take action based on what is in there, and there is no legal recourse for failing to act based on what is in there. There are some legal repercussions for things like the definition of the wildland-urban interface, or WUI, but the CWPP itself is not a binding document. In and of itself, it is not a funding source. It is also not just a checkbox for grant applications. So while there are many grants that require a CWPP, the CWPP ought to be able to stand on its own if you fail to, if you do not get the grants that you do apply for after it. CWPPs are founded on the concept of building a fire-adapted community. So this is known as the FAC wheel, the Fire Adapted Communities wheel. It is a way of showing all the different ways that a community can take action to be more adapted and resilient to wildfire. The idea is that you cannot prevent or stop wildfire. We tried that 120 years ago and it didn't work, but we can minimize its effects on our communities and our livelihoods. So when we do this, we approach the process a few different ways. We like to look at process over products. The document itself isn't the most important thing to me when I'm writing a CWPP. It's the conversations and the building a shared vision of the future that is most important to this. Those repeated interactions when you meet monthly or bi-weekly or however frequently you meet with your core team and your partners lead to that more normalized collaboration that you want. We prefer to be inclusive over exclusive, so the more people that have some kind of say in the process means we'll have a more rounded plan. And it should be by the community, or for the community, by the community. So if the community is going to take action on it, in order to have that buy-in, they need to have some say in it. It needs to be representative of their own community. I'm going to hand it over to Bree to talk about why you might need a CWPP.
Thanks, Kenzie. Yeah, so now they have a little bit of a sense of what a CWPP is. We'll chat a bit about why you need a why your community might need a CWPP. So first and foremost, I want to highlight that a CWPP is a tool. And like any tool, it's most useful when you know what you're trying to accomplish with its use. And as is indicated by those HFRA requirements that Kenzie was talking about a couple slides back, CWPPs are meant to help address wildfire risk by building community responsibility for wildfire mitigation actions. And here the term community that we're using includes both the residents of an area and the organizations that serve them and the land. So the CWPP framework brings partners together to assess relative risk in a community and strategize how best to reduce the risk identified, all while strengthening the trust and relationships that are needed to actually get things done on the ground. So for an example, the fire districts in Long Island, before developing a CWPP in 2016, were somewhat uncoordinated and unaccustomed to wildland firefighting. They had some wildfires in 1995 and 2012, but found that during those incidences, they didn't really have the right tools and knowledge to address them in an effective way, since there was no unified command and their main method of attack was directly spraying the head and flanks of the fire with water while wearing things like structure gear and regular clothes. Along with a couple other organizations, worked to develop a CWPP and were able to coordinate planning and action. So moving forward, they have red card certifications. They have a lot more prescribed fire happening on the ground in the longleaf, which is the ecosystem that's predominant in that area. And they have a tool that allows for an IC structure that is set for wildland incidences that they can utilize now as they do experience wildfire in that area, and they now have the tools and knowledge to efficiently and safely both address wildfire and prepare for it. So then the question that we have to ask is, when you're thinking about developing a CWPP, is a CWPP the right tool for you? And coming out of that, how are you identifying whether CWPP is the right tool, is does your community face wildfire as a risk? And we're all familiar with the fact that wildfire risk is an increasing concern nationally. And while the West, which is where we would typically think of wildfire as a major concern, is where a lot of the kind of mind space of folks goes when we think of wildfire risk. Fire is a part of many of the ecologies across the US, and so is by no means confined to the West. And additionally, it's not necessarily fire as a risk is not necessarily confined to the wildland part of this continuum that we think of as the wildland urban interface. The broad regional risk that we're thinking about when we're comparing the West to other regions in the US is not the only level of risk that we need to think about when determining whether or not an area may be facing wildfire risk. So CWPPs as a tool are particularly useful where in places where there are multiple different landowners, different land uses, community groups, and government agencies to contend with. So we're developing and working off of a shared understanding, and that allows for a coordinated effort for wildfire mitigation and improved community awareness in those areas. So they work especially well in places where we're not just contending with wildlands, or we're not just contending with sort of urban spaces, which urban spaces also have needs on fire mitigation, which may or may not actually fit into the category of wildfire, but we can still work to plan for those in a tool like the CWPP.
I see that there is a raised hand. Go ahead and type any of your questions that you have into the Q&A section.
Thank you, Kenzie. So, as I was kind of alluding to, fire risk extends beyond where we're typically used to considering it, and is continuing to grow. And in assessing whether a community is at risk, we can think about the fact that local conditions may enable wildfire in places where fire is not typical. And many of those wildland urban interface fires and fires that turned into things like more along the lines of urban conflagrations have human ignition sources. So if your area historically did not plan for the hazard of wildfire, you can sort of consider whether your community is along the wildland urban interface, and if it has risk factors, including things like fuels buildup, poor evacuation infrastructure, and potential for human ignitions, to identify if your community is at risk in a way that you might want to consider utilizing a CWPP as a tool. When I am assessing whether or not an project area is a good choice and scope for a CWPP, I'll typically think along the lines of how big the area is and what kind of landscape we're looking at. So thinking along the lines of size, typically CWPPs will cover areas that can range from neighborhood size to county size. And those that fall in the middle of that range do tend to be the most actionable. And then in terms of thinking about landscape and where a CWPP would be useful in a landscape sense, areas where there is a wildland component or open spaces, including large private lands. So not just the categorization of wildlands as places that are public lands. So thinking, are there wildlands and open space in this project area? And then also, do people live within the project area? Is there a community that we're contending with as we're planning for this? And then the final aspect that I think about when identifying whether a CWPP is a good choice for an area is, are there partners there that are going to be engaged and committed and will work together to develop this CWPP? The actionable CWPPs really have, lack of a better term, a community of practitioners who are engaged and committed to moving beyond just putting the document together into actually working together after the document is created. So back to this question of, is a CWPP the right tool for an area? There's these kind of four main places where you can kind of ask yourself, do we have a wildfire risk? Is the size of the project area one that is likely to include enough partners where it is a collaborative effort, but not so many that it's unwieldy? Are there interested partners in that project area to work with? And are there wildlands and open space that coincide with people living in an area? Now that we kind of have spoken through some of the pieces of what a CWPP is and why you might consider one, I want to talk through a broad outline of the CWPP process before I hand it back to Kenzie, who will go a little bit more into depth on some of those pieces. The CWPP, we call it a roadmap, but the breakdown of the CWPP process kind of comes down to these three component pieces that pull together into a final document that, again, like we were highlighting before, do follow past the final document's generation. So the community and partner engagement will thread throughout the entire process, and you'll see aspects of it come out in the hazard and risk assessment, as well as the prioritization and implementation stage. The hazard and risk assessment will take the data that is available in the community, both the data that are, you might think of like the maps, and also the knowledge that's contained within the partners and the residents. And then that pulls into the prioritization and implementation stage that will identify priority areas and projects, and is where we get into doing some planning of the mitigation that's required by the HFRA. And then all of that goes into the final document that can be shared and used to sort of track progress. The timeline of a CWPP can be highly variable. We often see that CWPPs take about a year. An update will typically take a bit less than that, and a big, like, county-sized project or a project where there are other concurrent processes that you're trying to bridge with, and like for example, the HMP might take a little bit longer. And there are ways that you can modulate the timelines on this. Some places where if it's the only project you're working on, you might be able to reduce that time, but thinking towards the fact that it is a collaborative process, you'll be contending with the availability of most of your partners throughout that process. With community and partner engagement, like I had mentioned before, that'll thread through the length of the entire process. And we typically see projects with some kind of core team that's made up of 5 to 10 folks who represent the partners and relevant parties. Usually that's where you'll get the local government folks, fire districts, state government, and federal land management agency folks who are present in that project area. And then there's a sort of a broader partner group of folks with a professional interest in the outcome of the CWPP. And then, of course, those residents and community members who live in the area and whose wildfire risk we're working on reducing or addressing. The hazard and risk assessment typically focuses on local fire behavior and identifying community structure and the values at risk. And will often include community assessments. The prioritization and implementation section is where we're thinking about those prioritization meetings and having an action plan that's developed. This is also where you pull in some of that outreach and education planning. And then finally, that document generation that pulls all that knowledge that you've spent likely around a year putting together and gets it into a document that can be shared with the community and with the partners. So with that, I will hand back to Kenzie to give us a little bit more depth into those broad buckets that I was chatting through.
Thank you. All right, so let's start off with our first step in the CWPP, identifying and engaging the partners that we're going to work with. Partners will look different for every CWPP that you do, but this is the base of your partner group. This is your core team is part of your partner group, and your core team will be kind of the smaller group of people that are really driving the CWPP, but a CWPP partner can be anyone that has some kind of input in your plan. So when I talk about partners, I say that a partner is anyone who has a person, a group, or an organization that has a professional interest in the outcome of the CWPP. So someone who has a personal interest is someone whose home or property is there. And many partners may have a professional and a personal interest, but the professional interests are those who are representing their organization or representing their agency or group within this process. So there are a few that you must include. So like I said before, through the Healthy Forests Restoration Act, HFRA, you do need to include someone from a local fire department, someone from a local government, and someone from your one of your state foresters. And these are the 3 required signatures on your CWPP. So for them to sign, they do want to be involved throughout this process. I like to think of partners in 3 different groups. So we have the general public, those who have that personal investment, the personal interest in what happens in the CWPP, and they're engaged at very specific touch points through this process, especially because there's so many of them. We need to be thoughtful in how we engage with the general public. We have our broader group of partners. So the broader partner group are anyone that has that professional interest in there and has a reason to give some feedback, input, insight into this process at certain points. So we're going to engage them at some phases of the process, but it's really hard to convene everyone all the time. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a smaller group called the core team. This may be your planning group, your working group, whatever name you want to give it. But these are the most active and engaged partners throughout your whole process. And they're engaged during the entire CWPP. So what is a core team? A core team, selecting your core team is one of the most important steps in developing a successful CWPP. These are the folks that drive the process forward. If you have a core team that is engaged and wants to see a collaborative, effective outcome, you're going to have a plan that reflects that. If you have a core team of folks that you're pulling teeth to get them to come, they aren't interested in participating as much, or maybe they aren't interested in working with other folks, you may have a plan that reflects that. So taking the time to develop a working, effective, and engaged, enthusiastic core team is an essential part of this. They meet regularly throughout the process. How frequently you want to meet with them entirely depends on you and your core team. My preferred way is to meet every other week with them. So once every 2 weeks, I like to meet, and those meetings can be a little bit shorter. If you meet once a month, you might have to meet a little bit longer during those times, but it's whatever works for you and your core team. And these folks are the ones who are making key decisions. So you probably want to have at least those 3 that we talked about: the fire department, local government, and state forester involved, but you may choose to have a few more. So who else might we want to bring on the core team? Well, we might want to include a local emergency manager if they're one of the ones leading this, especially for a county process. Community planners may be included in the core team or in your broader partner group, especially if they know that there's a lot of development growing. There's a lot of new development coming in the next 5 to 10 years. Having someone who's a community planner represent on this team is going to be really helpful in knowing where, how to define your WUI and other things like that. We'll get into that. You may have a local business organization, and they may have some insight into what would really help them and what they can provide to the community in terms of wildfire mitigation. If you have major landowners like large ranches or groups like that, that may be another person that you want to engage, someone representing there. If you have any owners of infrastructure, they may not necessarily own a lot of land, but they may own some of the critical infrastructure like utilities companies. You may want to engage with tribes or nations, whether they do or don't have land in your area. It may just be their ancestral land. And if you can get someone engaged in there, that's going to bring a very good perspective to your partner group or core team. You may have some conservation groups, whether that's water, wildfire, wildlife. They may be excellent partners for you as well. And then anyone who is able to accurately represent the vulnerable populations in your community. So ask yourself, who's missing? Who does this core team here have enough folks? And does my broader partner group have enough people to represent the cross-section of community that I'm trying to get to? So in order to do this, in order to get a group, you need to have knowledge of the community. Who is it that is here in the community and who represents them? And then you need to have a time commitment from your core team members. Are they able to provide the amount of time and feedback that you are asking of them? If not, it may be worth postponing until you can have a group of engaged core team members that can devote the time that's deserved. So next, let's talk about engaging with the community. Excuse me. I like to think about this in 3 phases. I like to plan for multiple touch points to this. We want these to be authentic and high quality, so you don't need to, do every single thing possible. You want to get ones that are going to be valuable to your community. So you want to tell folks what you're going to do. You want to do it, and then you want to tell them what you did. So we start out by informing the community about this process, the CWPP that's going to happen, and how they're going to be engaged throughout it. Surveys, focus groups, whatever you choose. You're going to do that, and then at the end, you want to share back. What have you done, and how did you include their input? So let's start off with informing the community. There are plenty of different ways you can do this, but your goal here is to let people know that this is happening, when they'll be engaged, and what outcomes they can expect. So a news release is a common way to start this off. You may have a community kickoff meeting. You may develop a website. There's lots of different ways to go about telling the community that this process is going to happen. But the important thing is that you're letting the folks know that this is a public planning process that is going to be happening. Next, we want to gather community input. There's a lot of different ways to do this. None of them are going to be simple. None of them are going to be easy. And you have to be thoughtful about which ones are going to be most effective for your community. But you may choose to do a survey. This is classic. It can give you a lot of good information, but of course, people are wary of surveys. So you may not reach out to everyone that you're trying to. So you may choose to do focus groups. You may have interactive community meetings where you're not just telling the community what's happening, but they're giving you information on whatever you're looking for from them. What are their values? What are their barriers? What concerns do they have most around wildfire? You may choose to do interactive mapping activities with them. You may choose to go down the route of listening sessions. There's no right or wrong way to do this, as long as you are authentically gathering some of the community's thoughts and opinions. So the goal of this section of gathering community input is to give the community a chance to shape their plan. This is for the community and by the community, so it needs to represent them. And then last, we want to share back what we've done. So of course, we'll have the community want to be able to read the final CWPP document. You may give them, especially if it's like a county level plan, you may give them a chance to do public comment on it before it gets signed by a county commissioner. You may want to do a website or a story map. A story map is like an online interactive mapping web page that folks can look into, but some way for folks to look online and get the information they're looking for about it. You may also have a final community meeting or an open house. The goal of this is that you are demonstrating that you used their input when you are making the action plan, and then you give them actions to take. So you're telling them, here is your risk level, especially if they have high risk. Here's actions you can take to reduce that. So you're pairing those two together. Diversity in the planning process brings ideas, recommendations, policies, approaches that might not otherwise be overlooked. So we want to gather representation from as good of a cross-section of the community as we can. If we get more people giving us ideas, thoughts, opinions, we'll get new ideas. And these new ideas that just the core team may not have means that we'll have a more robust plan. If we take the time to make sure that people feel represented, included, had their voices heard, and then that made a difference, you're going to have heightened community buy-in. If you have more community buy-in, you're going to have a more effective plan because people are willing to take action based on it. They're not just being told what to do, they helped shape what their community is planning to do. So you need a few resources to do community engagement. You need some trusted community leaders, people that are able to connect you with both vulnerable populations and different parts of the community. You need to probably have meeting spaces, some kind of equipment if you're doing that. And of course, if you're doing surveys or other things, you need to have whatever technology and tools that you are required, that you are planning to use for those. Mapping is something that happens throughout the entire CWPP process. So let's talk about it. I like to think of mapping in 3 phases. We start out by defining the community. We describe what the wildfire risk looks like, and then we display the solutions that we're recommending. So this is an example of different maps that may help define the community. What we want to do is orient those who are reading the CWPP or using the online maps to the area they're looking at. A lot of people don't know what the shape or boundary of their fire district or their county may look like. So you want to tell them where that is. These are 2 different maps that help just define the community. So we have some vegetation maps to help show what kind of vegetation we have, or a social vulnerability index map to show what kind of where we have higher rates of social vulnerability in this area. These are just a couple of ways you may choose to describe your risk. So one of these is a map that shows the different expected fire behavior that we may have in an area. So we can see the areas that are that darker red on the left side have higher risk, and on the right side where we have the blues and the whites, we have less risk. That's one way of describing wildfire risk. Another way is having different risk for different neighborhoods in your community. So if you break it up into a neighborhood, you might be able to say which kind of neighborhoods have which kinds of risks. There are many ways to do this. These are just two examples of how you may show risk on maps. And then last, you want to display solutions. So we want to show folks where in this area are we doing those landscape scale treatments that the HFRA, the Healthy Forests Restoration Act, are requiring. So these are just, again, two example maps to show where those projects are within this community, and then we're zooming in on that project area and showing what within that we may be trying to protect or defend or mitigate risk around. So in order to have maps, you do need someone with mapping expertise. You don't necessarily need an expert map or modeler to get good maps. There are many places that have high quality risk maps, vegetation maps, and other things like that that are ready to use. Most states, not all, but most states in the US have a state wildfire risk assessment, or in the Southeast and the Northeast, there are wildfire risk assessments for groups of states. Those are ready and accessible. You do need to have some kind of mapping software. This could be something paid like ArcGIS, or you can use free tools like QGIS and Google Earth Pro. Those are excellent tools for making good maps that are plenty good enough for your CWPP. And you will need data from partners. There's a significant amount of data that you can get online free. You should not need to pay for data that you are looking for unless you are paying for custom risk assessments. But there may be some data that you can't get, like critical infrastructure of power and water utilities, things like that, that you may be able to get from your partners. So your partners need to be able to give you some of that. So let's talk about the fire risk assessment. When I talk about risk as a combination of both hazard and vulnerability. Hazard is how likely is it to burn and how intense is that fire going to be? And then vulnerability is how exposed is something like a house or a piece of critical infrastructure or an evacuation route, and how susceptible is it to being ignited? There are many, many, many ways to look at risk. None of them are right or wrong. You can look at potential fire behavior. This is a standard one that you'll see in a lot of CWPPs. You can look at what difference there is from now to a historic fire regime, how much it has changed in the last 150 to 400 years. You can look at recent wildfires and recent wildfire trends. You can look at the risk to values and infrastructure and residences, and you can look at the change and impact from climate change. All of these are different types of risk assessments that you can use in your CWPP. So just a few examples here. On the left, we have one that's a risk map that's looking at hazard. This is fire intensity in Colorado. In the middle, we have one that's looking at fire need, that sort of difference between historic fire regimes and current fire regimes. So that's the ones in Michigan. And then on the right, we have one that's looking at fire risk, which is a risk that, excuse me, that is the potential that fire will harm people or properties in the US or in this area. So all of these are valid types of risk assessments. Another thing that you can do to help understand the risk is to relate this risk to values in your community. These may be values that your community told you about in your gathering community input phase. And these may be values such as FEMA lifelines, those critical infrastructure, things that the community needs to survive. So communication towers, energy infrastructure, evacuation routes, things like that. So these are just two examples of ways that you can look at how fire behavior here is affecting roads or homes. So we're looking at roads in red that may be susceptible to high flame lengths, or which homes here are exposed to embers here on the left, or on the right, excuse me. So how do these risk assessments inform our CWPP? If we're going to do all the work to get a risk assessment and understand it, how are we going to use it? Well, first, we want to use it to educate. Some folks have a really good understanding of wildfire risk in their area, and research is showing that people generally do have a fairly good understanding of risk in their area. We use it to quantify the risk. So while many members of fire departments are able to say, I know where in my community is most at risk, has the highest fire hazard, that's not on a map. That's not something that they're able to easily share with others. So this is a way we can quantify that, put numbers onto pieces of paper to help us make good decisions. And then, yeah, we use them to prioritize our actions. So which areas may have more risk, more susceptibility, more hazard. Those areas are more likely to get action than those that have lower risk. So in order to have a wildfire risk assessment, you do need to have some kind of GIS or mapping support. Again, many regions of the US have existing wildfire risk assessments, and those are accessible and easy to use without additional paid tools. You want to have someone who has fire behavior expertise, who's able to interpret those. So likely a member of your fire department, potentially state foresters, maybe it's folks from the US Forest Service who are really familiar with this, or your local watershed areas, but someone who has the ability to interpret these maps and help the core team understand them. And then you want to have some critical infrastructure locations that you can use to assess that risk to the critical infrastructure. And again, you might get some of that data online, you might get some of that from your partners. Another way that you can assess risk is by doing on-the-ground risk assessments. We can model risk on there, but it is also very important to see what it looks like on the ground. This isn't a required part of it. You can do this instead of a map-based risk assessment, or you can do this in addition to a map-based risk assessment. But you will learn a lot by seeing what conditions are on the ground in your community. So the goals of doing an on-the-ground risk assessment are that you can see the risk that's relative across your community. And what I mean by that is you can see what kinds of risk are in certain locations and what that kind of gradient of risk is, because what it looks like in your community will be different than what it looks like in another one. The types of risk and the level of risk will be different. You want to probably focus on the risk to structures, critical infrastructure, and evacuation routes. That's what we do when we do these. And the idea, my end state, what I want to see is that we identify what areas, what residential areas or evacuation routes in this place have that highest risk, and what specifically we can do to address that type of risk. So why we might do these, why we might choose to take this on. We may want to gain some situational awareness of our community. If we haven't looked at our wildfire risk before, this is a great opportunity to understand it. We can also look and see if our models are accurate. Most models will be at least somewhat wrong. That's okay, that's normal, they're just models. But we can go out and ground truth them. We can see, yes, this makes sense because of this, or no, this doesn't actually look right to me. Let's adjust how we're going to interpret this map based on that. It's a great time for us to get photos. So I like to include as many photos as I can that are local to this community in CWPPs so that the community can see themselves, their roads, their neighborhoods, their recreational areas. If I can get those local photos, that's going to be more tailored to that community. And this is the best opportunity to do that. And I can get some qualitative data. There's no model that's going to tell me that one neighborhood has a lot of wooden fencing that goes between houses and that's something that maybe needs to be addressed. But another neighborhood that doesn't have that fencing has firewood under their decks everywhere. Those are different types of qualitative data that we can gather from on-the-ground assessments. If you choose to do this, there's 4 steps you take. You're going to divide your community up into different neighborhoods, ones that make sense, that maybe share vegetation, topography, evacuation routes, the type and size and building materials of the homes. You're going to develop some assessment criteria. So what are you looking for? Are you looking at the residences? Are you looking at the roads? What things are you going to take note of when you're out and about? Then you go ahead, you conduct the assessments, and then you analyze your data. Analyzing can be as simple as tallying numbers. If every community that has a certain number of one-way in, one-way out neighborhoods that have some evacuation concerns, maybe they all get 1 point or 5 points, and then you tally those up and see what numbers look like across. So to share that, to show one example of what that might look like, this is a relative risk map for one community that shows the different risk ratings for each of their neighborhoods. And you can see this is an overall map, but how we use this is we break it out and we write a little bit about each of these neighborhoods. And so we say, here's the kind of fire you expect to see. Here's the specific risk types we're seeing. So maybe some communities have a lot of those evacuation hazards, but they don't have a high fire risk. There's not as much of a chance for high fire, but it's going to be really hard for everyone to get out safely and effectively if there is a fire. Some may have significant home hardening and defensible space risk, whereas others don't have that. So we're going to write about that. We might show some photos, and then we're going to tell folks what their most important steps are to take. So this is where we choose to address structural ignitability. What we try and do is we use local guides, we reference things that already exist so we don't have to make up recommendations every time. So for example, Colorado State Forest Service has their home ignition zone guide. Many other states have something similar, and we can reference that and use facts and figures and guidance and recommendations from that guide. We like to make it local. Like I said, we want to use local photos, local terminology. We use the neighborhood names that people already identify with, and we want to show the benefits. So it's not just that if you treat your home, you're going to be less likely to burn down. It's that if you treat your home, your driveway or your roads, you're making a safer place for firefighters to be, you are increasing wildlife habitat, things like that. So if you choose to take this on, you will need some kind of mapping support so you can document where you're going, where your neighborhoods are, and where you've been within those neighborhoods. You'll want the time to drive and the vehicle. It can take anywhere from a couple hours to a couple days to do this. We usually want to have 2 people in there, one person who navigates and takes photos, and another who's driving. We don't want you to be driving and looking over somewhere trying to look at houses at the same time. You'll need some kind of device to take photos and notes on, and basic data analysis support. So someone who can take whatever numbers or qualitative data that you get and turn that into action, recommended actions. So let's talk about defining the WUI. This is a very important part of the CWPP process in many places. I say WUI. WUI stands for Wildland-Urban Interface. There are many implications for how you define the WUI. Some of them may apply to your community and some of them may not. So you may have an area that chooses to adopt a WUI code. These are code recommendations from either a county or a city or a fire department, and they can choose to enforce that code only in areas that are defined as the WUI or through a CWPP. So if you choose to change the definition, the boundary, the map of the WUI for your CWPP, you may change where needs to be enforced. So again, you want to have someone who's on planning or code enforcement in your partner group so they can give you information on that. It may affect how you choose to, treat fuels and where you prioritize. So areas that are in or near the WUI may be higher priority for treating. It can be a tool to get grant funding. So some grants may choose to offer funding or higher consideration for areas that are in somewhere that's defined as the WUI in a CWPP. And for US Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management lands in the US, they can get what is called a categorical exclusion to the NEPA process, the National Environmental Policy Act. So what this does is this reduces the process that that the US Forest Service or the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, has to go through to do fuel treatment on these lands. And the reason for that is that if it's defined as WUI and it's high risk, they can move faster to take action to reduce fuels in these areas. So it is an opportunity to work with the Forest Service and get a categorical exclusion or another form of streamlined process to get more treatment on federal lands. And then, of course, communication and outreach. You want to be able to effectively tell the community what is and what is not WUI. It can be complicated. It is complicated, especially if you're looking at communities that have a gradient of vegetation or density. So there is no right way to define the WUI. The right way is whatever works for your community. But you do want to think about each of these different implications and have an informed conversation based on that. So in order to do that, you need some kind of mapping support. So you may want to see where the homes are and home density is in your area, or vegetation density, and having some kind of maps can help you make those decisions. You need local knowledge of regulations and codes. So having someone from your city or your county that can talk to that and speak to that is really important. And if you do have US Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management lands, then you do want their input in this discussion as well. Many states do also have WUI maps. The US Forest Service also has a WUI map, and these are good starting places. They don't have to be the one you use. They can be the one you use, but these are good starting places for you all and your core team to discuss. All right, let's talk about fuels treatment prioritization. Now that we know the risk, now that we've seen that risk assessment, what are we going to do about it? Well, when we are prioritizing actions, we're balancing the needs and the benefits versus the impact, the value, and the feasibility of these actions. We can't treat everywhere, so we do have to make choices. So some of the needs you might be considering are that fire behavior, the values at risk that you have, that critical infrastructure, if you have potential control lines for fire, and if there are any previous treatments that have already happened. And under feasibility, you might be looking at slope. Is it too steep to feasibly do treatment? Is there public or private land ownership? Do we have community support? Do we have funding? So these are all different things that you need to take into account when making your priorities. You and your core team and your partners, you want to take all of the risk assessments, the community information, and the input that you've gathered, and all of the goals you came up with at the beginning of your process to determine where that risk reduction will be most effective. So these are a few of many different things that you can look at, incorporate into your prioritization discussion. You might be looking at evacuation routes. You might take into account what came out from your community survey or focus groups. You may want to look at proximity to homes or infrastructure. There is no one right way to do this, as long as the decision makers here are using all of your relevant and available data to make some informed decisions. So these are just a few different examples of ways that different priority project maps can look. There's no one right or wrong way. These are just decisions that these core teams made based on all the data and information they had. So in order to do this, you probably want to have some kind of maps for people to reference, whether these are printed maps, online maps, ones that you're putting on a projector screen in front of a group. You want to have some kind of tools to define your project area. You can do GIS analysis for this. You can also take crayons and markers and draw on maps. And we do that, and that is a very good and effective way to define project areas. You want some kind of meeting space, and you'll want information on what recent treatments have happened in the area. So you're not prescribing a treatment or recommending a treatment for something that's already just happened last year. Evacuations are a concern for a lot of communities. And the CWPP is one place that you can choose to address those. Some states do have a requirement that you address evacuations in the CWPP. So why might we do this? We do want to educate the public about what kind of evacuation preparedness tools are in the area and what alert systems they want to be informed of and sign up for. We want to talk about how to increase access for both people leaving and firefighters incoming. We want to plan for how we're going to address vulnerable populations, as in those who may not be able to evacuate themselves. Do we have plans in place? And if not, do we need to take the time and make those? And then we want to make any recommendations that can help emergency managers when they're managing evacuations for wildfire. There's a few different ways you can go about this if you want to. You can model hazards with software. You can go on the ground with your hazard assessments and look at the different roadways and write notes and give them scores and ratings. You can get a group of people who have either experience conducting evacuations in the area or are the ones that have planned and prepared for evacuations all in a room with a map of the roads and talk about where are your major concerns for pinch points where things will get backed up, or areas for or areas where there's a lot of vegetation near the road and you have concerns about there being high flame lengths close to the road and potentially endangering evacuees or firefighters. The goal here is that you determine where on roads you need to work to protect lives and where residents need to be better prepared. So this is an opportunity to talk about evacuation preparedness as well as what maybe roadside treatment needs to happen. So to do this, you do need some kind of mapping support or meeting time with emergency management folks, whatever tools you're choosing to use. And then you need information on who owns the land, who owns the roads, and how big of right-of-ways they have and what they're allowed to do in that area, so you can make informed recommendations. These are complex, and so having as many relevant parties that have knowledge of this at whatever meeting you choose to have is really important here. What else can we do in a CWPP? We've already talked about landscape fuel treatments, we've talked about evacuations, and we've talked about resident mitigation. But that means on this FAC wheel, this fire adapted communities wheel, there are 7 other different slices of this pie to look at. So we can make recommendations and take action in each of these other sections, and the CWPP is a great place to talk about that. You'll have a lot of the relevant parties here, and you'll have a more balanced approach to risk reduction. There's a lot of options. There's no right or wrong way to do this, but a couple examples that you may look at is under that, there was one of the slices of the pie that was policy. We might choose to adopt or update a WUI code, or perhaps we update the local building codes. Under that response slice, we might look at recommendations for including to get funding for a new wildland engine if we don't have enough to support response in the next few years, or perhaps we are making mutual aid agreements for initial attack on fires that may come. Under that community engagement slice, we might look at starting a community ambassador program that helps people connect with neighbors on wildfire preparedness, or perhaps we create a home assessment program where people can get a professional or a neighbor to come out and see their home and tell them what needs to happen. There are so many things that you can choose, and as long as you have the folks in the room, your partners that have a knowledge of the community needs, of the fire department needs, and what tools and resources are going to be available, you can make some really cool recommendations. So what you need is probably some extended meeting time with your partners. These are usually longer meetings. We want people to be creative and have really good in-depth conversations about these recommendations we're making. And then you need to have knowledge of the community. What's feasible, what's reasonable, and what's needed. Now that we've talked about risk, our priorities, let's bring this all together and make an action plan so that the CWPP doesn't sit on a shelf, as it were. We have our goals. We identified those at the beginning. Perhaps our goals are to understand our risk, to make a couple landscape scale recommendations, to understand what the community needs, and to provide 1 or 2 programs that can help address those community needs. Perhaps those were our goals. We have our community input, so we did a survey, focus groups, listening sessions. We understood what the community needed. We did our risk assessment, so we know where on the landscape we're expecting more intense fire behavior. And then we have our priorities. So what we're going to do now is we're going to fill out an action plan with these SMART goals. You may have heard of these before. Our goals need to be specific. So we don't need to say on this specific parcel, we're going to treat this many acres and take our basal area from this number to this number. We don't need to be that specific, but what we're trying to do is give folks who read this plan 3, 4, 5 years from now a direction to go in. So they know within this section of the landscape, we need to do thinning and slash removal and taking care of some of the ladder fuels in this area, something kind of like that. We want them to be measurable, so how many maybe acres you're looking at, or how many residents you hope to serve with something. It needs to be achievable. There are so many different things that we would love to happen, and so many different things that are absolutely not going to be able to happen in the next 5 years. So we want to set ourselves up for success. It needs to be relevant to what we're talking about. How does it address the issues and problems that have been identified? And then we do want to create some kind of time frame. When are we going to start this program? When should this project need to be finished by? We want these specific details for these actions, and you and your partners will be filling this out. Our goals are to make this project actionable, use everything that we've gathered up until this point to make a good action plan. We want to plan for maybe 5 years of action. It depends on what your CWPP update cycle is, but 5 years is a generally accepted recommendation for that. And we want this to be collaborative so that people are working together for this. We want to have enough projects in here that you may have some that rely on grant funding and some that don't. So you can still be successful even if you don't get all the grants that you're hoping for. So you'll need a lot of meeting time. Again, we're working with our partners to do a lot of this, and you'll want partner buy-in and support. Lastly, our fun part, the document. So the CWPP document does need to include everything from our HFRA recommendations. So we need to have it signed by those 3 entities, the local government, the fire district, and the state forester. We need to identify those areas that are highest priority locations for fuels treatment. And we need to talk about reducing structural ignitability. But most of them have some other information in them. You have a background on the community. Maybe you talk about recent wildfires or recent explosive growth in your area if you've been experiencing that. You talk about the risk assessment that you used. You want to summarize what kind of process you went through. You may want to have maps and figures to share what you're saying and anything else that's in your state. Use whatever was relevant to your process and put that in the document. You optionally can include anything else that would be helpful to your community. So one thing that we sometimes do is include a summary document. This is basically the bare bones bits of the CWPP that we want to share with residents. So what defensible space, home hardening, and evacuation recommendations we want them to have, and maybe we share what those neighborhood recommendations that we created were. It's really short, it's action focused. We're not asking people to read a whole big government document. Another thing that's very popular are websites and story maps. This is online. These are usually interactive, and they have the opportunity to be regularly revised and updated. So we can update the progress on some of our action items as we're going, and people can access it more easily than maybe a PDF. There's plenty of templates for story maps, which is a tool through ARC Online or other websites that can help you create a CWPP website or a hub. So CWPPs do need to be updated. They aren't something you can write once and be done with. We typically places recommend updates for every 5 years. It gives you a chance to review the document, update what fuels treatments have happened, and update your action plan to take off anything that was complete or add new action items that are relevant. You don't need to go through the entire process for an update, but if you are, you may need to go through an entire new sort of CWPP process if you've had some kind of major wildfire or a disaster that really changes that risk landscape for you. If you've had a lot of development, and if your risk assessments or CWPP are more than 10 years old and out of date, they probably don't reflect your community right now. And so you may need to go through and do that again. So CWPPs haven't always been living documents. If they were easy to update, then we would have them updated more frequently. And so that's one of the goals, is to make your document something that can be updated. So save not only the PDF that you create of your final document, but save whatever working document you use, like the Word document. If you're making maps, save that map data so you can use it and just update it the next time around, and then you don't have to start from scratch. Use what you have. So if you have an existing CWPP, even if it's a bit out of date, you can use that rather than starting from scratch. If you have a group that's working on wildfire in the area, keep track of the updates that you've done, keep track of all the progress that you've done, so you can just put that in the CWPP. You don't have to go through getting all that information at one time. And set yourself up for success. So maybe have a commitment for an update at the end of your document. You know that you're going to update it in 5 years from now, and that's part of your action plan. So what you need, your resources, you need to have either a template or a previous one. You don't need to start from a blank Word document. No one needs to do that to themselves. There's plenty of templates online that you have access to, and you can choose to use your organization's previous CWPP as a good starting point. You'll need whatever maps and figures and photos you want. You may get these from partners. You'll need to have some time to write, and you want to have time for your core team and your partners to review and provide feedback on this. A note that I'd recommend is you write as you go rather than saving the process of writing everything until the end. That can be a bit daunting. I'll hand it back over to Bree.
Or the even more fun part, is that the document was the most fun part. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the logistics, kind of thinking about costs, contractors, and grants. So how you actually fund doing a project like this and what those costs might look like. The costs kind of generally are outlined here. And I want to note, just as I'm talking about costs, that at the Ember Alliance, we do, while we are a nonprofit, we do work on contracts to help folks develop CWPPs. So some of the information that I'm giving you is both from sort of a more general stance, and then also from a little bit of the stance of some folks who kind of work from the contracting side. The costs of a CWPP can be pretty variable. Major factors include the size of the area that you're looking to develop the CWPP for, the complexity of the modeling that you've decided you want to include, the amount of community engagement that you're looking to do, and who's going to be doing that community engagement, as well as some of those additional deliverables. Things like story maps can add cost to the project, but also add value to it. Updates do tend to be less expensive than new CWPPs, and contracted projects tend to be a bit more expensive. A couple notes on cost, that as you're developing those costs, you need to factor in the cost of living into any estimates, the timing that you're looking at developing your CWPP during. I was talking before about how it could take 9 to 18 months. Well, depending on how much you're trying to fit into that time, the time frame that you're looking to develop your CWPP in. If you're requesting an accelerated timeline or trying to fit within an accelerated timeline, it might be more expensive to do. Additionally, if there's a lot of travel involved, you or your contractors need to travel to complete groundwork, that may be a little bit more expensive. And a note on kind of looking at contracting costs, I would highly recommend getting multiple quotes if you're planning to use a contractor for any part of the process. You don't need to contract the entire process. Some folks choose to just contract portions of it. But getting multiple quotes means also getting multiple proposals, which means that you're getting a chance to see which contracting group might be a better fit for you. No contractor approaches a CWPP or its components exactly the same. And every community is going to have a slightly different set of needs. So talking to a number of different folks can be a great way to make sure that you're getting what you need. When you're thinking about whether or not to contract, these are a couple pros and cons that I've kind of utilized in helping communities to think whether or not they need to contract their CWPP out. Many communities do choose to contract with professionals to develop their CWPP or parts of it, and the reasons to do so are varied. When you bring in a contractor, you bring in often technical expertise, both for the modeling, and you're hopefully bringing in folks who have done CWPPs before and they know what they're doing and can help you to navigate the process. They'll also will be able to bring you and your community a little bit more capacity to the project development, and they'll have facilitation experience and be good at kind of helping to prioritize projects. However, especially if you're working in a place where CWPPs may not be as common, the contractors may not be local. So they'll lack that local context and that knowledge, and you'll need to make sure that that's something that is coming from that you have and is brought in by the community. And it can be more expensive, as I was mentioning before, to contract a project. There can sometimes be some communication barriers, depending on how you set that project communication stage up. Hopefully they're good at that, but it is something to look out for. And contracting can limit the adaptability of a project, but by no means is that an insurmountable hurdle. If you choose not to contract and complete the project in-house, you still will need to develop a budget for the project. So as you're thinking about how much it's going to cost, I have a few questions here that would help to make sure you're incorporating all the costs that you'll incur in the development of a CWPP. So this includes things like staff time, as well as trainings for staff so that they have the expertise that's needed, and costs like translation or accessibility services that you may need to utilize during community engagement, or printing costs, things like space rentals, some of those little things that can slip under the radar as you're thinking up at that broad scale of the project. It's easier to forget some of those little costs. So asking questions like, what knowledge and resources do staff need to lead this project, can answer questions like, do we need training? And also the question of what pieces can partners help us accomplish can help you to build a picture of, maybe you have a partner who has the skill of translation and you wouldn't need to budget for that, or maybe you do. Answering those questions can help you to identify what resources you need. As Kenzie was kind of pointing out, on each of those resource slides, kind of all of those have some degree of an associated cost. And coming back to that question of contractors, contractors can provide services like project management, meeting facilitation, mapping, modeling. So those folks can, and document writing, and those folks you can contract for just pieces if you think you're able to do the meeting facilitation and the document writing, and lead outreach events, but you need help with the mapping and modeling and the document writing. You can work that out with your contractor, and you don't need to hand the entire project over. And you'll need to bring with you that scope, your idea of what the scope of the project is, and be able to provide accountability to your contractors. And as I was mentioning before, that connection to the community that the local folks bring is really important in a CWPP. So if you're working with contractors, it's really important to make sure you bring that through active participation in the CWPP process. You will need to fund the project, as we're kind of talking a little bit about budgets. I also wanted to highlight a couple ways that folks often will fund a CWPP. You may not need to use grant funding. Some places are able to fund the CWPP without it. However, a lot of communities do find that they need external funding. So for example, funding from grants. And the Community Wildfire Defense Grant is one that is a federal grant that is intended to assess at-risk communities and tribes in the development and use of CWPPs. The grant gives priorities to areas that have high wildfire potential, benefit a low-income community, and are impacted by severe disasters. There are 5 rounds of funding, and the round 3 should be announced in late spring or early summer of this year. So that's coming up soon. And I'll take a little bit of time to give a brief overview of how to write a successful grant. To start off, you'll need to assess whether you and your community are eligible for the grant. With the example of CWDG here, there is an eligibility tool I have highlighted on the right-hand side here that can help you to assess whether you're eligible for the grant. But even before, as part of this early steps of assessing your eligibility is registering for a system for award management account, because those can take a couple weeks, and you don't want to be right up against the wire with your grant application and find out that you don't have an active SAM.gov account. So that's a good thing to keep current, especially if you're planning to apply for federal grants. And then reading through that notice of funding opportunity, or NOFO, can give you an idea of whether you're eligible for that CWPP. And the CWDG eligibility tool here is a great starting point for assessing your eligibility. With writing a grant, the other really important piece is to collaborate often and early. And the reason for doing so is that collaboration on a grant proposal helps to create that full picture of what your needs are on the project. You can join forces with folks and therefore be able to leverage their strengths and resources and ideas. And if you do that early on in a grant, you have a better sense on what everyone can bring to the table. Finally, in writing a grant, you do need to craft a story and actually write the grant application itself. So your final grant application should paint a picture of what you and your partners plan to do, and include things like your need, what kind of collaboration you're planning on doing, and also give a solid sense on the sustainability of your project. The funders want to know how you're going to keep that momentum that you're building in your project time span going beyond the time frame of the grant, and then include measures of success and your budget and timeline. And that budget and timeline can fold into illustrating your need and your collaboration. And I want to highlight again that you're not alone in doing a grant application for something like CWDG. The Community Navigator Program is an awesome resource and has some amazing folks working on that, and they can help you through the Navigator program to figure out how to craft that story and make sure that you're best positioned to move forward with your CWPP and your grant. We are little close to time. We might have a moment or two for some questions.
Happy to stay on for a few extra minutes, Emily, if anyone who wants to stay on has questions that we can talk about.
Awesome. Thank you so much.